Hey everyone, and welcome to this podcast. In this episode, what I want to do is explore just a little bit of this new book by Eric Metaxas called Religionless Christianity, God's Answer to Evil. The book just came out, I think, this last August in time for the new Bonhoeffer movie. And what I want to do is just take a couple of themes from the first chapter. And the first chapter is called, Are We in the Last Days? And so he is talking about the end times, and he's wondering, has the church lost its message and its voice? Have we become embarrassed of different theological terms and Christian terms and biblical terms? Are we even embarrassed about talking about the last days or the end times? And that's one of the arguments that he makes in this chapter. But what I want to do is focus on a couple of paragraphs that start on page 3. He writes this: In our fear of seeming odd and off-putting to non-believers, haven't we accepted too much of the world's secular assessment of things? Has our salt lost its saltiness? How much of the secular cultural narrative have we accepted without realizing it, such that we are no longer the prophetic voices of God in our generation, and are therefore a mere shadow of the true Christian faith? For what we imagine is the sake of our witness, have we become the domesticated house cat version of what God intended to be a wild and fearsome lion of true faith? To what secular pressures and narratives have Christian leaders acceded, thinking it will help them reach the unchurched? Has it been an effective tack? To make the gospel more palatable for the contemporary world, the church has accepted certain secular ideas and secular values, all in the name of evangelism. And so what he does is he takes Bonhoeffer's religionless Christianity and he uses it as a way to criticize the church for becoming too secular. Now, the problem with his argument here is it doesn't really fit with how Bonhoeffer understood the world. And it doesn't seem to fit with Bonhoeffer's understanding of religionless Christianity. Now, what Metaxas does get right is Bonhoeffer is criticizing religion and morality and ethics as the focal point of Christianity. But what Metaxas gets wrong is that for Bonhoeffer, religionless Christianity is about going back to the world. So let me read just a little bit here from Bonhoeffer's letter and papers from prison. This comes from a letter written to him, or to Bethke, on June 8, 1944. And this is in the context of Bonhoeffer unpacking what he believes about religionless Christianity. But what he's doing is he is talking about kind of the history of theology and the history of Christianity, and is making a claim about how the church has responded to the world come of age. Now, what does he mean by the world come of age? What he's arguing is that the church is growing up, that in developments of science, of medicine, technology, sociology, humans are developing. Our consciousness is growing. And so the world is moving from being childlike to becoming an adult. And what he does in these letters, this letter here, is he's criticizing those who want to try to go back to a prior time where the world was a child. And he's specifically criticizing the type of Christian response that Metaxas is giving in his little book. So let me read here just a little bit, and then I'll try to stop and make some commentary. It says, but in the last 100 years or so, this has also become increasingly true of religious questions. It's becoming evident that everything gets along without God and does so just as well as before. As in the scientific domain, so in human affairs generally, God is being pushed further and further out of our life, losing ground. The historical views of both Catholics and Protestants agree that this development must be seen as the great falling away from God, from Christ, and the more they lay claim to God and Christ in opposing this and play them off against it, the more this development considers itself anti-Christian. The world, now that it has become conscious of itself and the laws of its existence, is sure of itself in a way that is becoming uncanny for us. In very different forms, the Christian apologetic is now moving against this self-confidence. It is trying to persuade this world that has come of age that it cannot live without God as its guardian. So what he's saying is as the world develops and becomes more conscious of itself and grows in its confidence, is the language that he puts it, religion, Christianity, begins to push back. It pushes back against scientific development. It pushes back against all kinds of human development that seem to be leaving God behind. But here's how Bonhoeffer then continues in thinking about the Christian, he calls it the Christian apologetic against this world come of age. He says this, I consider the attack by Christian apologetics on the world's coming of age as, first of all, pointless, second, ignoble, and third, unchristian. Pointless because it appears to me like trying to put a person who's become an adult back into puberty. What he's saying is that the Christian church shouldn't be fighting the world's growing up or the world's coming of age. And he says that it is pointless because it's like trying to take an adult and put them back into puberty. And then the final thing he says about it being unchristian, I think, is really significant. He says unchristian because it confuses Christ with a particular stage of human religiousness, namely with human law. And more about that later. So what he seems to be saying is that the Christian apologetic against the world's coming of age in all of these different areas is unchristian because it wants to go back to a former way of religion or religiosity. And what Bonhoeffer is suggesting with religionless Christianity is that in the same way the world is coming of age, the Christian church and Christian faith now has to reinvent itself and see itself in a different way in relationship to the world. He says this, the question is Christ in the world that has come of age. And then he goes on to critique liberal theology and say the problem with liberal theology is that it just makes a space for religion that then becomes morality and ethics and so on. But then he wages a critique against the more traditional conservative Christianity, and this is the response that Metaxas seems to be giving. So he says, those who long for movement in life are dangerous reactionaries, backward looking, because they want to go back before the beginnings of revelation theology and seek religious renewal. They haven't understood the problem at all. So their talk is completely beside the point. And then he says, the fact that the world has come of age is no longer an occasion for polemics and apologetics, but is now actually better understood than it understands itself, namely from the gospel and from Christ. And later on in a letter dated July 21, in the last few years, I have come to know and understand more and more the profound this-worldliness of Christianity. He says, later on, I discovered, and I'm still discovering to this day, that one only learns to have faith by living in the full this-worldliness of life. So the problem with Metaxas' version of religionless Christianity is he seems to be using it in a way that Bonhoeffer doesn't use it. He is using it to critique evangelicals for becoming too secular and trying to appeal to the secular world. Bonhoeffer, on the other hand, is arguing that we must all become secular, that we must go back into the world. The secular world is not the problem. The problem is religion. The problem is otherworldliness. That when we focus on an otherworldly version of faith and fail to recognize that the kingdom of God is coming here to transform this world, and that we are being called to live as human beings in this world, and that's at the heart of what Christian faith is all about. This is what Bonhoeffer means by religionless Christianity. For Bonhoeffer, religion allows us to not fully live into our humanity. It allows us to become irresponsible, to not have to take responsibility for our neighbor. And so I just raised 3 questions here as we think about what Metaxas is writing. Number 1, what does he mean by last days? What does he mean by end times? He doesn't really define it, but what he does is he takes kind of a fundamentalist evangelical approach to the end times or the last days, which becomes an otherworldly form of Christian faith. This is not what Bonhoeffer believes. This is not what Bonhoeffer stands for. Bonhoeffer's Christianity is about a kingdom of God that is breaking into this world and transforming this world. And then what do we mean by secular? It's very clear that for Metaxas, the secular stands over and against the Christian world. The secular is seen as bad, and the Christian is seen as good. Yet, when you read more of Bonhoeffer, what you find is the line between secular and faith gets obliterated. And there's a sense of going back into the world and learning to live as human beings with God at the center of human life, not having to be afraid of the developments in human knowledge, history, science, any of these different fields. We can embrace these things and live as Christians within them. And then finally, the third question is, where does Bonhoeffer fit in everything that Metaxas is saying? On the one hand, he gets some things right. He talks about Bonhoeffer's criticism of religion and the problem with making ethics and morality the center of the Christian life, but then continues to take religionless Christianity and turn it into an otherworldly form of faith. And actually wants to make it into something that is about power. He talks about the domestication of the gospel and wants to put it in strong language. And yet everything about Bonhoeffer is about living into our weakness. It's about taking up our cross and following Jesus. It's not about conquering the world for Jesus. It's about allowing the world to be free to be the world because Jesus has died and has been raised from the dead. And so there's a tension between what Metaxas is doing with Bonhoeffer's religionless Christianity and what Bonhoeffer is doing in his writings. And so I want to continue exploring this by taking different parts of this little book and comparing and contrasting it with what Bonhoeffer actually says in his letters.